Welcome. Two great conversations await. I'll just tell you briefly. Mark Bittman, of course, is the renowned New York Times writer on food. He has books and columns and content that spans decades and speaks to a worldview of knowledge when it comes to food, eating, restaurants. It's going to be great to talk to him about his latest book, Animal Vegetable Junk, where he takes on big food and re-examines the nature of the food we eat. How it's prepared, where it comes from. It's a revolutionary notion, and you can see this evolution in this guy, Bittman, who has come so far, as I said, covering this world of food. Then Sara Kamali, she has chronicled the causes and manifestations of a rise in white nationalism and militant Islamists in her unique and latest book. She talks about everything from the rise of QAnon to disinformation, the threat of these groups in the coming years, but she is optimistic through it all. So there's that as well. We'll start you with the food, and then we'll finish with the rise of white nationalism. There was a question, maybe we should start with white nationalism and, chase it with something sweeter. We've decided to open with the food and Bittman and finish with the second conversation, which will be Sara and the rise of white nationalism and militant Islamists. Thanks for being here. Thanks for subscribing. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage, it means.
Hey, look, I just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
You know this guy, longtime writer of the New York Times about food, author, an exceptional writer on food in so many ways that go beyond recipes and taste, looking at where the food comes from, looking at sort of the total picture of food. I think Mark Bittman stands by himself in this genre, talking about food in that way. Mark Bittman, everybody. Yeah. Mark.
Good day.
Yeah. So excited to have you here. I've been reading your stuff for a long time. As I was just saying, one of the things I've noticed about your stuff, meaning the books, the columns, the things you write, ideas you share, is you've taken the idea of what's on the plate and how it tastes and whether it was braised and whether, the gravy was thick enough, whatever it is, and you've traced it back to where it came from and how it was raised or what the farmers used in the soil. You see, in a way, the totality of food. And that seems to have been something of an evolution for you. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I started, I started 40 years ago, so there is a bit of history here, but I started with the enjoyment of food, cooking, travel, ingredients, restaurants, the excitement, all of that. And as the years went by, it just became more and more clear to me. It probably could have happened more quickly, but sometimes I'm not that bright. It just became clearer and clearer that what was important about food was not only how it tastes, of course, but where it comes from, how it's grown, how it's processed and produced, how it affects the lives of people who do the growing and who do the work on food, how it affects our bodies and the planet. And those are all huge issues.
Mark Bittman, are you raising parakeets in your spare time? What is that bird that I hear in the background?
The quietest place in the house right now is outside. So
okay.
You're going to have to live with the birds, I think.
This is where you're speaking to us from the Bittman estate, are you?
Yeah, the estate. Yeah.
The estate that food built. So to that point, has your palate changed through those years? I mean, you're looking back over decades of writing about food. Were you a different writer then and a different taster than you are now?
Well, food's evolved, and my palate has evolved also. Yes, I think I like simpler food. But when I started writing about food, we were in an era where French food in particular and European food in general was the food that was taken seriously by food writers. That's obviously changed. You could compare that to music in a way, which evolved from mostly being European in the United States to becoming world music. We've evolved to the point where we appreciate more of the foods of the world, and we also understand that the origins of food are not particularly in Europe. So that's all changed. My personal palate has changed because I think I like simpler food, and other people my age, that is older people, have said that that's a thing that happens. So, but I think that, to address your audience directly, or at least where you are directly, I'm going to quote Alice Waters, who always says, and not exactly in these words, but in words similar to these, the best thing you can do cooking wise is take good ingredients and don't screw them up. And that's another way of saying that simple food is best if you start with good ingredients. And I think that more and more people are coming to that realization.
Alex Waters, I'll remind everybody from Chez Panisse. You know, she's one of those remarkable chefs, and she's also written a lot on food, I know. When you go back to those days so long ago when you just started in this profession writing about food, were you alongside other food writers and critics who had the snobbery about food that you might find around the wine business or something? I'm trying to imagine what that world is like.
Well, certainly the generation, most of them now dead, ahead of me, had a more snobbish and Eurocentric attitude about food in terms of food writers and chefs were revered. But again, I think that to the extent that you were associated with haute cuisine, or what we thought of then as serious cuisine, you were talking about French food. And that's really, really changed. And I think that there's still a certain snobbery associated with more expensive restaurants and with people who, I don't want to say take food seriously, but who take themselves seriously. But more and more, I think, or I like to think, that we're seeing a bigger picture. We're seeing that it's not that what's important is not how fancy food is, but again, how it's grown, how it affects our bodies, how it affects the people who work on it.
You call it European. I'm thinking of the richness of that food. European, is that sort of shorthand for the butter and the rich sauces that are associated with that kind of food?
Yeah, butter, rich sauces, highly trained chefs, starched white uniforms, high prices, like that.
Well, the last couple of things strike me as all show and less go. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm going to get into the evolution and where you are now, but how much of the dining experience is that? Not associated necessarily with the food, but with sort of the presentation.
You know, I think it's interesting because the last year, of course, restaurants have taken as hard a hit as any industry, and we're going to have to see what happens when they start to come back. I'm not sure whether people miss socializing in public or they miss being waited on in a formal way, but we're going to find out. Myself, I like to have food cooked by other people. I do a lot of cooking of my own, but I like to have food cooked by other people, but I'm not that interested in haute cuisine or in high levels of service or things like that. And I don't know what's going to happen to that sort of high-end restaurant scene.
Yeah, I can't figure out if that's sort of one of those areas that's inoculated, if you'll pardon the expression, from, you know, the economic damage of the pandemic. That is to say, there's such loyal customer base there that they may come back. But the cost, obviously, of running those establishments is high, and sometimes the rent associated with it is costing them a lot during the time that they're closed. So I think it's hard to handicap it.
Yeah, it's not clear what's going to happen. It's not clear what people are going to have the patience for, the desire for, the budget for. It's very exciting. We'll find out.
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. So as you have cooked, as you have eaten, as you have written through the years, I was mentioning your evolution, and you've looked at where that stuff on the plate has come from. And it's really, I feel, and again, this is what I'm getting, and I can't wait to get into your latest book. I'm getting that it's changed you in a way, in the way you look at the stuff on the plate, but also kind of the way you look at the planet.
Well, I think that one of the points that I'm trying to drive home in Animal Vegetable Junk in the new book is that it's not just that we take food for granted, many of us do. It's that we don't take it seriously enough. This is obviously not universally true. I don't mean to generalize, but many of us don't look at where food comes from. We don't look at what it takes to produce it. And we don't look at the impact that it has on the economy, on public health. Look, let me give you an example, which is a public health example. COVID killed 300,000 people prematurely, caused 300,000 premature deaths in the United States in 2020. Every single year, chronic disease kills more than 1 million people in the United States prematurely, and most chronic disease is diet related. So we have to look at food and say, what is food for? What do we want it to do? And I think the answer to that is what we want it to do is we want to nourish as many people as affordably as possible with minimizing the impact that agriculture has on the earth. So we don't say what's the best way to produce food for the most people in this country or in this world. We don't really ask that question. The question that's most often asked and answered about food is, how can we grow it and produce it most profitably? And that profit is not for the benefit of farmers particularly, or the benefit of eaters at all. It's for the benefit of big food companies. So the big questions about food don't get asked. The question that gets asked is, where's the next meal coming from? Obviously an important question. What's the food taste like? Sure, that matters also. But is this food high quality? What's the impact that has on my body? What's the impact that has on the earth? Those are questions we need to be taking seriously as individuals and as a society.
You know, in your book, Animal Vegetable Junk, A History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal, you discuss these issues to which you referred. And I think about the fact that even within big cities, you can find food deserts that have been written about and talked about for a long time, where you see the power of big food, where there's nothing in the way of a healthy option. You're beholden to these things that you know to be, in a way, poisonous to your body over time. And yet, over time, these are the only options around you. I'm talking about a lot of fast food.
Yeah, you're making a terrific point. And statistically, it's true. We know that ultra-processed food, which is mostly fast food and food sold in convenience stores and snacks and soda and so on, we know that ultra-processed food makes up more than half of the calories that Americans consume every year. So in a way, it doesn't matter as much where you live. 50% of the calories or more that we eat are going to be closer to poison by the dictionary definition than they are to food. They're going to make us sick. And those are the calories that are out there. That's an agricultural decision. What we grow is not necessarily what we want to be eating, although that's how it should be. So if we grow things that are destined to turn into junk food, that are destined to turn into unhealthy calories, those are the foods we're going to be eating. And some of us have more choice than others. Obviously, accessibility, affordability are very important issues, but someone is going to be eating those anti-nutritive or whatever you want to call them calories.
You mentioned the fact in your book, the food consumption and the way that we treat the harvesting of food around the planet has exacerbated climate change. Can you give me a minute on that?
Sure. It's not just that, well, there are several factors. One is that the more land that you clear, the more carbon gets spewed into the air. And agriculture is not a carbon sequestering system, it's a carbon spewing system. So it's not only when you burn the rainforest, which is the prime example of putting carbon into the atmosphere that we can currently think of, but it's also normal industrial agriculture stirs up the soil, puts carbon into the air, and then fails to put it back into the soil. Carbon it's not only important for carbon to be not in the air, it is important to put it back in the soil. So that's one thing. Industrial raising of animals is also responsible for a huge amount of greenhouse gases. Some say as much as fossil fuels or as much as transportation. And that comes not only from the infamous animal belches, but cow belches, but it also comes from the growing of corn and soybeans, largely for animal food in industrial conditions that, again, takes carbon out of the soil and puts it into the air. So whether agriculture is the leading cause of greenhouse gas generation or the second leading cause or even the third, it's up there, it's important, and there are other ways to do agriculture that generate fewer greenhouse gases.
It strikes me also that agriculture is actually going to be on the business end of a lot of these climate change agricultural belt movements, meaning as the climate changes, and it changes radically, if you're a farmer or if you're in the business of growing or even of raising livestock, you may have to make some serious decisions about your future because you're not going to have the same climate that you had 10 years ago.
And everybody is saying that. I mean, if you talk to farmers, even farmers who are effectively climate change deniers, they'll say, well, yeah, it may be bad, but it's just a blip. But everybody is noticing that the South is moving north, I guess, is the way to say it. And it's extremely worrisome for people near you in the Central Valley, where the climate's already plenty warm enough. What happens if it gets warmer there? And We've seen it in the oceans. We've seen it among fishermen. Fish are among the more sensitive species to climate change. We've seen the migration of fish, fisheries disappearing and appearing elsewhere. And there's a lot of talk about the impact of climate change on agriculture. But I think you were right in asking the first question first: what's the impact of agriculture on climate change? Because that's looked at a lot less, and yet it's really important.
So people are really wedded to the way they eat. No one wants to be told, hey, you got to put down that and eat more of that other thing. Unless that other thing is full of butter and sugar, don't tell me about it. We're really stubborn. I mean, I've seen friends of mine who literally have had transplants. And after the transplant, they say, you may want to watch this particular thing and watch your intake of that. And they can't do it. Or they don't want to do it. I mean, we have a certain stubbornness, like I'll be the master of my own destiny type thing. And so I'm wondering, as you've evolved to this other place where you talk about the integration of more plants and vegetables into the meals. I mean, that wasn't the guy you were decades ago, I'm wondering if you have seen it around you and in correspondence. Do you get pushback or do you get applause now?
Well, look, I get both, but we are trained, our food preference, we are not born with our food preferences. We are born with taste buds, but our taste buds can be trained. And we have been trained for several generations now. We have been trained to think that breakfast should be sweet, lunch should include soda, dinner should be fat and sugar and salt. We have been convinced that our preferences are a part of ourselves, and indeed they become a part of ourselves. But food marketers target kids at ages before the kids really know right from wrong. So when kids can be convinced, as you and I and millions of others have been convinced, that Tony the Tiger is their friend and Coca-Cola is the most fun drink that there is in the world, and McDonald's is the best place that you can be eating when you're out of the house. And we learn these things when we're little, and everybody over the age of 20 who's tried to change their diet knows how hard it is to address those food preferences. People will say, I'm going to try to eat more fruits and vegetables. I'm going to try to eat less junk food. I'm going to try to eat less sugar, or I'm not going to eat dessert or whatever. And everyone knows how hard that is. And that's for two primary reasons. One is that junk food is engineered to be addictive, or as nearly addictive as possible. And two, we are trained at that early age to prefer foods that are ultra processed, high in sugar, high in salt, high in fat, and so on.
You help us a little bit in one of your recommended strategies toward eating. You did a book called, is it VB6, Eat Vegan Before 6?
VB6, yes. And VB6 was a strategy that I adopted to basically force myself to eat more. Because these preferences are so hard to change, we need rules in our lives. Many of us, anyway, need rules in our lives in order to change them. And what I decided was that I was going to spend the entire day, every day, eating nothing but food that was really good for me. So not only vegan, but no white food, no sugar, really whole foods, mostly fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes. But then after 6 at night, I was going to do whatever I wanted to do. So it's kind of a part-time veganism, 2/3 veganism, whatever you want to call it. And it works. But any discipline that gets you to eat more whole foods, again, the key groups are all the plants that we know: fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains. Any diet that gets you to eat those things in greater quantities and eat less junk food, that is one thing that every single person who thinks about nutrition will agree upon.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And you're right. Sometimes we need strategies or a hook to hang our behavior on, and that's a good one. It just struck me as a real sensible one. The word that you haven't used that I use is indoctrination. We're indoctrinated at an early age in our eating habits. I mean, if I had never been raised with meat, then the idea of eating meat might gross me out, later in life. But we're raised in a certain way, and I just think we're indoctrinated. You've essentially said it. You just haven't used the word, but I'm just saying that's the word I use because I think, Mark, the reason, the reason you're not drawn to that naturally is because, you were raised in this other way and indoctrinated into another pattern of eating.
It's absolutely true. Your preferences were hijacked at birth, basically.
Thank you. That's exactly it. So last thing, we only have another minute or two with Mark Bittman, but, one of the things I was mentioning at the beginning of our conversation is I really enjoy the way that there's sort of a global, not global meaning Earth, but meaning complete look at the food that you talk about, that you cook, that you recommend. When it gets to animals and animal welfare and even fish and, the overfishing, and you alluded to the oceans and how they're changing, I'm wondering what your impressions are now and how they've changed through the years.
Well, I think that from even if we put health issues aside, and the nutritional information about animal products is confusing, although it's Lancet, the medical journal, recommends that people in Western countries like the United States cut their intake of animal products by 90%. That's obviously a lot. But Lancet is taking into account not only people's health, but the environment. And when you look at the environment, there's no way we can continue to raise animals and eat them the way that we're doing now and at the rate that we're doing now. So my feeling is that meat needs to be raised better, that is more humanely and under better conditions and with less impact on the environment and so on. And that probably means we'll raise less and it'll probably be more expensive. And that's not a bad thing because it'll cause us to eat less and it'll cause us to eat better meat. And those are both good things.
Yeah, it just seems that those forces pushing back on that, as you say, big food, may be too tough to tackle, but we may not have a choice. So, but those are great goals that you lay out. And you're optimistic? You think a lot of these changes that we have to make, societal changes, cultural changes, these changes to our diet, you think we can actually make those changes?
I don't know if optimistic's the right word, but I'm hopeful. We have to head down the road toward building a better food system and toward building a better society. And the ways that we do that, I think, are by strengthening democracy, growing the public sector, generally subsidizing what's right and unsubsidizing, disincentivizing what's not right. And I think those are big issues. This is an interesting time. It's a time we can make progress. We have to make progress. And I think that's what's important here, really.
The book is Animal Vegetable Junk, A History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal by Mark Bittman. And you have a friend in our show. I hope you'll come back and visit. It's really great to talk to you. And as I say, I've been a fan for a long time, but really great to finally get a chance to talk with you.
Appreciate you saying that. And it really was fun. You're a great host, and I will come back anytime.
Mark Bittman, you heard it.
If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Sara Kamali is here. Sara, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
No applause for Sara Kamali. What's wrong with you? Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Sara, that could be overlooked so early in our relationship. The book is Homegrown Hate: Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the United States. So, Sara, I mean, a more perfect book for a more perfect time, I can't imagine. White nationalism, the growth of it, the focus on it, I think as a result probably of the growth of it, is something we've all become, I'm going to say, suddenly aware of. Clearly, you've been studying this issue for some time. How long have you been working on the book and your research?
Mm-hmm. Well, the book specifically for 12 years and the research about 2 decades.
Wow. So how has it changed in that time? In other words, how has white nationalism changed, the growth of it, the forms of it, and militant Islamists? I wonder if you can just speak to the way that they've evolved through those years.
Right. Perhaps maybe not evolved, but maybe morphed, I think would maybe be a more appropriate term, only because let's see here, for white nationalists specifically, the confluence of the different categories that I use, so anti-government, racist, theologically racist, and the conspiracy theory oriented aspects have all become they've all coalesced. And what we're seeing currently, especially during the last 4 years, has been the normalization of white nationalist tenets that both call for a white ethno-state and also the dehumanization, essentially, of people of color. With militant Islamists, we're seeing actually more of a status quo. So their ideology is parallel to white nationalists in that they really rely on a narrative of victimhood, but militant Islamists have also always relied on this narrative of the United States foreign policy, specifically causing a lot of harm to sincere Muslims around the world through U.S.-led wars, for example. And so that narrative has remained part of the status quo messaging, I would say. And
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it's the one thing you can say about militant Islamists is they don't change their message. It's consistent through the years. But it's fascinating to hear about white nationalism and how it has engulfed all of these other things that you're talking about, conspiracy theories and extremism, it seems, of all types. It's like the white nationalists have the big tent now when it comes to hate.
And I think, white nationalism has definitely always been there. I mean, the reason I've been researching this for so long is because it has been a phenomenon within the United States and indeed in many countries around the world. But really, again, what's changed, and I think when you use the term engulf, that's quite a good word, because it's really permeated a lot of the institutions and become so normalized and accepted. So, for example, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in media circles, as well as certain politicians have stated this week and last week, or denied the reality of systemic racism in the United States. And we can see that white nationalists, for example, have always had that denial of systemic racism. But the difference between now and maybe 100 years ago, when the KKK led a really huge procession in Washington, is that now it's become normalized. White nationalists no longer need to hide their faces. People can spout these tenets on media and not be condemned, but be supported because of it.
Sara Kamali, the guest. Homegrown Hate is the book. So this is interesting when you talk about the normalization. You're saying that there is what were the linchpins to normalizing that white nationalism and that hate?
Well, of course, Donald Trump and his administration, both with its rhetoric and its policies, have really accelerated the normalization. But then we can't really forget about the Tea Party movement. And the different figures that have come between that and Donald Trump. And of course, there's always been political figures who have upheld the idea that America should be solely for white people because it was founded by white people. But really, I think Donald Trump's administration has really harnessed these ideas and again, mainstream white nationalist ideology, both within politics and within the media.
Yeah, this is interesting that you mentioned the Tea Party in that, sort of you're saying masquerading as those who want to lower taxes and you want to get less government. You're saying in that somehow you can find the white nationalism and the strains of it that you find in many of these other places.
Well, I think certainly that idea that these policies that were once considered extreme are now mainstream, really we find the seeds of that within the Tea Party, within the modern context. So I don't think that we necessarily could have had the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right rally if we didn't have the push for the Tea Party to normalize what were quote-unquote extreme views.
Two things I will get to. One is January 6th and also the solutions that you suggest, or I presume that you suggest, for how to perhaps tackle some of this. But first, I just want to explore a little bit more of what you're talking about when it comes to what's going on with these white nationalist domestic terrorists. Because it's interesting, because the extreme Muslim terrorism, okay, the militant Islamists, they actually helped out the haters who are in the white nationalism camp. Isn't that right?
Well, they certainly play off of one another. So
that's what I mean when I say help out. Yeah, exactly.
Right. There's Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a large platform within white nationalism, and so too is the crusaderist the crusaderist imagery of within militant Islamism. That I wouldn't necessarily say that they are the sole reason for the cause of each other, for example, but they definitely do play a part in propaganda. So they're effective propaganda tools for each other, I would say.
It's funny because after 9/11, you saw the rise of that propaganda, and as 9/11 faded, I mean, it's so remarkable that's even a fact, but it has. It seems as though, again, this is from the outside looking in. You're the one who's researched it for all this time. It seems that the white nationalists, that hate is now living off of resentment of liberalism and of people of color and of benefits that are given to immigrants that are not received by others, or whatever the base of that propaganda is. It seems to be more varied in the platforms it uses to get to that hate.
The white nationalist platform is varied, you mean?
Exactly.
Well, I would certainly say that 9/11 actually hasn't gone away. So what we know from the way that the current counterterrorism paradigm was built around the idea that Muslim Americans in general are criminalized because of the actions of a few militant Islamists who are not even American to begin with. And then, of course, the U.S.-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. So what we do see in the way that we can see the effects of 9/11 specifically is in the current counterterrorism paradigm, and also this general notion that's not really being challenged today that Muslim Americans are, potential terrorists, for example. And so what we really need to do is shift the narrative away of who can be a terrorist and make sure that we also think of white nationalists when we're conceiving of what terrorism is today. And rather than just specifically a hate crime or specifically, something else within the legal realm, but to really use that type of what is often considered a pejorative term and very much linked with brown people, even though Muslim Americans are not necessarily brown. But that idea of who can be a terrorist, I think, is something that will help us address and reconfigure what white nationalists, what the ideology of white nationalism today.
And that is just wild. We're talking about Homegrown Hate, the book done by Sara Kamali. And in Homegrown Hate, it's funny to me, you address the fact that this somehow can't be viewed as terrorism. It's funny that white nationalists can distance themselves from the terrorism, the very terrorism to which they point, like 9/11 and like that which is perpetrated by militant Islamists.
Yes, that is an excellent. Yeah, that's a excellent, astute observation as well that I do discuss in the book quite in depth. Because if we look at the deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil perpetrated by an American citizen was not by a militant Islamist, but by Timothy McVeigh, a white man, an Army veteran. At the Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995, the anniversary of which recently passed. And it was the 26th anniversary, and yet there wasn't a whole lot of mention of that. And again, when I'm speaking, we spoke earlier about the normalization of white nationalism and the mainstreaming of the tenets of the racism, of the conspiracy theories, worldviews, of even the religious views that support certain versions of racism. That's come into play recently in the media too. That America was not, in fact, founded upon genocide of indigenous Americans and is not indeed systemically racist. So that's something that I also discuss in the book. Is that how does that privilege come into play, and why is it that we're not questioning what a terrorist can be?
Sara, tell me about. I'm sorry, just in our limited time for the radio. Tell me about the January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol and how so many of these different elements came together.
So So what we know about the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th was that they're mostly men and predominantly white, and also not necessarily young group, but around the ages between 20 and 40, believed to be rightly elected. They were also calling for the institution and implementation the Trump administration's rhetoric and policies around making America great again, around racism, around anti-immigration, around the support of QAnon, for example. So really what that rally was not only calling for Donald Trump to be president again, but it was also calling for the United States to be a white ethno state by extension.
Wow. I want to touch on the solutions right now, and then we'll continue this conversation on the radio. We'll continue the conversation on the podcast that we don't have time for on the radio, and so I'll get to a couple of other things. And so to the solutions. Solutions is probably too suggestive a word, suggestive of there actually being a soluble problem or a solvable problem. But what are the ways to attack this?
Right. Well, currently the United States is very fragmented along political divisions, and essentially people are political identities. So it's very much a landscape of tribal politics. And that notion, the title says homegrown hate, and of course the subtitle is waging war. Really, that war can also be along political lines as well. So in terms of approaches, we really need to address the underlying systemic racism, which many people in the political far right want to deny, but also many people on the political left are also they're central to dismantling the systems of oppression, and they really need to recognize their central role in doing so. So one of the principles that I talk about, one of the principles I talk about or write about rather is an engagement with the history of not only white people, but also the many communities of color that have really contributed to the creation of the United States. And so that can be through history, that can be through organizing, that can be through activism, but really there needs to be white liberals essentially need to come together in order to amplify the work and the voices and the people and the rights of people of color, and people of color also need, there needs to be a greater solidarity amongst the activists who are working for very many different justice issues, and recognize that it's essentially all, along the lines of dismantling systems of oppression, along the lines of systemic racism. And I think, there needs to be a lot more unification, which I call for in detail in this framework I call holistic justice in the book.
I just think it's, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'm just going to end with, it really is based on empathy and anti-oppression. Those are the two pillars.
It seems like a bridge too far in some ways right now. I get so dejected when I look at this country that seems so separated, so tribal, as you've said. One of the things you touch on in the book that I think is so very important is the way that law enforcement treats these different groups, these different terrorist organizations. So you talk about white nationalists and you talk about militant Islamists. Tell me how we treat them when it comes to law enforcement in America?
Well, first of all, the word terrorist, we know, directly applies to militant Islamists and not necessarily to white nationalists.
And that's a federal designation? Sara, who makes that designation?
Oh, okay, yeah. So there's a federal criminal statute for terrorism that applies to militant Islamists that does not apply to white nationalists. So that does not mean that there should be a federal criminal statute for white nationalists, because that's going to cause a whole host of problems. But what that does mean is that there's something also with extra sentencing, essentially. So if one is designated as a terrorist, like most militant Islamists would be, they also receive heftier sentences, essentially. And so there can be equivalents made for cases of white nationalists that are not now currently in the process. So there's a way of essentially treating these different terrorist in the eyes of the law, the same without having to what would be enact a federal criminal statute of domestic terrorism, because what would happen in effect is the criminalization of people of color, such as Black Lives Matter advocates, such as Standing Rock activists, etc. So as we know, there's a disparity in the carceral system and what we currently call the criminal justice system, whereas if you're white, you receive lesser sentences and your punishments are not as severe, whereas if you're person of color, then that is certainly not the case.
I mean, these biases are becoming, I think they were always quite clear, but really nakedly clear as you see so many associated with, for example, the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. You see them even treated differently than people of color who would violently perpetuate an insurrection.
Right. I mean, we can even see that if you look at video footage, for example, on the day about how police responses to Black Lives Matter demonstrations around the country, especially in 2020, and then the response to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol are completely different, as is, of course, what you just mentioned, the response to the people themselves. And so, for example, the FBI is asking people to turn the insurrectionists in, whereas many Black people, especially Black men in this country, lost their lives, even though they were not convicted and they did not do anything. So there's a real disparity, which is why, this book was written for a long time, and the last time that I could actually change anything was towards the end of 2020. So it was not the fact that it's speaking to the events of January 6th and the fallout from January 6th really also speaks to the fact that we've been facing these issues for decades, if not since America's founding. So really, this isn't anything new. It's just that January 6th was an inflection point that has forced us as a nation to focus on white nationalism specifically.
That's fascinating. That, you essentially in the book lay it all out. It's the building wave, and then after the book comes out, boom, the wave crests in the form of January 6th and the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Because all the elements to which you refer in the book were all played out. I mean, all those groups got together, and that became what we saw on January 6th as one manifestation of those groups getting together. I want to ask you, though, about white nationalism and other countries. Like, we didn't, white nationalism, I think you alluded to it earlier in the conversation, it ain't an American thing. I mean, it seems, as usual, we're doing it bigger and badder than a lot of other countries, but the reality is it's existed elsewhere. What's the state of it elsewhere? And I wonder if you can give us a little perspective on that as well, please.
Yes. So one of the last chapters of the book discusses how white nationalism is transnational. And the reason I say that is because the idea that the United States should be a white ethno-state, the idea of a white ethno-state is not, like you just said, exclusive to the United States. It's found in places like Australia, in northern and western European countries, for example. So anywhere that there's this claim to both blood and soil, which we've kind of heard, I guess the terminology of which has been more commonplace since 2017 in Charlottesville, this idea that the white people specifically have a claim to the land and that land should be solely for white people and governed by white people has led to a lot of violence as well in these areas. So, for example, in the UK, there are a lot of different groups that promote this idea. And the UK was actually one of the first groups in Europe to proscribe a terrorist group. It was actually many years before. It was around the time of Charlottesville, actually. And then we have also, with the rise of QAnon, which began essentially with Donald Trump's presidency in 2016. We also have how social media has really taken hold and shaped the way that these groups communicate. And we know, for example, even if we take the continent of Europe and the United States, that there's been a lot of communication amongst the January 6th insurrectionists in terms of not necessarily planning January 6th, but just in terms of sharing communications and sharing goals and sharing numbers. And that has really been accelerated by social media specifically. Now, these ties amongst different countries have actually always existed. But white nationalists, as I discuss in the book in detail, have always harnessed technology, whatever it is, be it publishing houses, be it newsletters, be it the internet. Very famous white nationalist by the name of Tom Metzger was one of the first proponents of using the internet to communicate, for example, and public access television. And now, of course, with social media, we have a sharing and a cross-pollination of not only ideas, but also memberships and affiliations. And this is most clearly seen with QAnon. So QAnon is white nationalist, and it's also religiously racist because it's supported by what I call a white nationalist view of evangelicalism. And so there are a lot of different factors going on, but I really do think that technology has, of course, really mainstreamed and created a lot of collaboration for these groups around the world.
I'm going to double back to that to which you just referred, which is the white nationalism as it's played out as religiosity. I want to double back to that in a second. But for now, I just want to follow something else you said, because you're talking about propaganda and vehicles for propaganda and the web and social networks. The other thing that's changed, it seems to me, and I guess I'm asking you, is that you don't need to go to the dark web for this hate. You don't need a 4chan-ish thing. I mean, that's not even the dark web, 4chan. But now you can get your hate right out in the open.
Right. And that is, I think, what has really normalized the mainstreaming. So what I say is that, we use these terms extreme instead of terrorism, for example, but what was once extreme is now mainstream. So very much terrorism is very much in the open, as well, any type of violence in the name of a political agenda, like creating a white ethno-state, like keeping America white, is essentially terrorism. And that's all been not only accelerated, but also acceptable, really, on online fora.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. Does this stuff, the online forums, does it masquerade at all as patriotism? Like, I see patriotism now. It's funny how these words, like patriotism and freedom, I see them now as words that are radioactive. When I see patriotism and freedom, I'm thinking, oh, I get it. You're a crazy alt-right, jihadist,
Yeah, and that, I think, yes. So, it's really interesting that you bring that up, because I was thinking about that today, and I was writing a piece on patriotism. And I really think that the radioactivity, specifically around the word patriot, speaks also to our divisiveness and our tribal affiliations. So there are certain segments of white nationalists who call themselves patriots, like they have an exclusive claim to the word, which of course they don't. Anybody of any political ideology, wherever one is on the spectrum, can be a patriot. But what's interesting to me is that there's a very specific understanding of what a patriot can be. And again, that is linked to the idea of the United States and, of course, many other countries around the world being a white ethno-state that can only be inhabited by white people and governed by white people. So one can only be a patriot if one meets this so-called ideal.
Right, exactly. All right, now let me ask you about the religiosity. When you drape this hate and this terrorism, it masquerades as religion. And you even mentioned it. You didn't use quite these words, but when sort of its reconstituted religion is just to justify the hate that you want to essentially serve up to your tribe.
Perhaps a certain reading of religion, for example. Yeah, there are many religions, actually, and that's something that I think is not necessarily discussed enough. The way that we understand and ingest and digest things does not necessarily lend itself to nuance, which is why it's so great to have a podcast. But there are actually many religions within white nationalism. So militant Islamism, of course, is a reading of Islam that's quite particular. And many Muslims would say, well, this is not Islam. Just the same with white nationalism is that there's a reading of Christianity that many Christians themselves would say this is not Christianity. There's a reading of Mormonism that or Latter-day Saints would say that this is not what the church actually is teaching. And there are many other religions that I talk about too. So Odinism, for example, it's a neo-pagan, or it's a Norse pagan religion and centuries old, and yet has been repurposed to, again, support and buttress the ideas of blood and soil, which are becoming, they're common elements of discourse within white nationalism. And there are many others, but those are some of the main ones. So it is really interesting. And then, of course, there's white nationalist evangelicalism, which has really a lot of the people who consider themselves white evangelicals have these nationalist ideas about a white ethno-state, and they are also adherents of QAnon. So I think that's also what complicates the public's understanding of white nationalism, is because it frankly is so complicated. And that's one of the reasons why it took me so long to write the book, because every time I thought it was finished, there would be a new element that would be on the rise, or that I would not be happy with putting my name on a book, quite frankly, knowing that there's something that I left out. And it also speaks to why the book is, 400 pages long. Not because it's kind of dense material, but because there's just so much to cover and understand. And, that's the other thing.
That's a lot of hate. That's a lot of hate, Sara. 400 pages of hate. Do you get right into the hate, or do you warm us up in the first 12 pages?
Actually, I start on a very positive note, and I end on an equally, if not more, positive note. So I do make sure to, I talk about the approaches and the holistic justice framework I talked about. How does empathy work in practice? What is anti-oppression? Why is that important to countering and also, I guess, combating the hate?
Yeah, I want to ask you about Q. I'll put that to the side, but for just a second,
yeah, sure.
Because I want to follow up on something else you just said, which was empathy. And I know that you had mentioned it once before, and that's sort of a centerpiece of one of the things that you feel might be a key to combating a lot of this hate that you talk about. Can you teach empathy?
Yes.
You teach empathy by telling the story of others and then providing enough of the details of other, cultures or people or history that you're saying then you just count on the logic and the reason of the person to whom you're addressing all of this information to do the rest?
Well, as an educator as well, I think any type of education framework must include experience, so experiential learning. And when I write about empathy and when I speak about it, I don't necessarily mean reading a history book and saying, oh, well, that's what that community contributed, or that's what that experience was like. Well, that's part of it, but then it's also getting to know people who don't necessarily look like you or don't necessarily have the same views as you, and really understanding why it is what they think. What are the experiences that led them to give them that essentially framed and shaped their worldviews. People of abilities, ages, nationalities, languages, etc. So it's not just about skin color, and it's not just about history books. And the reason that's important, too, is I think that, again, given the tribalism that we're facing today and the political divisiveness in which, if one is a Republican, then I'm never going to speak to a Democrat. If you're a Republican of this type, then you're never going to speak to a Republican of that, for example. And even within the Democratic Party and et cetera, and there's so many myriad combinations of that, is that it's really important to not try to convince people of what oneself believes, but really understand the world from the perspective of another person. And I think it's really that's missing today, that we're so quick to assume and judge and demonize. And whatever one thinks about Hillary Clinton's politics, I was, clear with a basket of deplorables comment, for example, that she made about Trump supporters. And of course, there's so many comments along the spectrum of the Republican Party that have been made against people who consider themselves Democrat and independent and all that. So I really think that there is this lack of communication, but also this lack of willingness to understand that is not only a threat to national security because it's really facilitating white nationalism, but it's also a huge cultural loss, quite frankly.
In our last few minutes, talking to Sara Kamali, her book, Homegrown Hate, Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the United States, I wanted to ask you about the rise of QAnon. It seemed to erupt overnight. And as you, in a way, you're the perfect person to ask this question to. Because as you study white nationalism and as you study radical Islamic terrorism, as you study these different groups, you must have seen the rise of the equivalent of QAnon in other ways, in other iterations of, these hate groups. Right. You must have seen them also similarly kind of be birthed overnight. So tell me, how did QAnon catch fire so fast and begin to dominate the public discourse?
Well, can I first ask you, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but when was the first time that you either heard about QAnon or learned about some of its principles or beliefs, I should say?
First, I love being put on the spot, so don't worry about that. And number two, let me think for a moment. Of course, I associate QAnon with the rise of Donald Trump and conspiracy theories generally. I'm going to say the lead up to the 2016 election. So without really, having marked it on the calendar, I'm going to suggest in the year prior to the general election in 2016.
Okay, so it was on your radar essentially close to its inception. So what's interesting, too, is that just like white nationalism is not new, for example, the KKK, which was founded by Confederate soldiers in the aftermath of the Civil War, violent groups espousing white ethno-state have been around. So, too, have conspiracy theories. And one of the predominant conspiracy theories of QAnon is that the liberal elite, politicians in the media, for example, are pedophiles and also drinking the blood of children in order to maintain youth. Now, this is also known as the blood libel, which has been it's an anti-Semitic narrative that has been around for decades, if not centuries. So really, QAnon is the latest expression of disinformation, of conspiracy theories, of racism, although anti-Semitism is not specifically, it's not racist, but, of an othering and of an un-Americanness that is levied and exploited in order to maintain power. And so it's definitely concomitant with the presidency of Donald Trump. And really the factors that I think have led to its rise is, again, this mainstreaming of hate, this normalization of white nationalism, and also the minimization of white nationalism. So we can see that the evidence of this, or one example of this, is that in the aftermath of January 6th, many of the insurrectionists really, they're slowly but perhaps not surely being found. We still haven't come to grips. We cannot even acknowledge white nationalists as terrorists. There is no necessarily, the systemic racism that has allowed also white nationalism to flourish and kind of plays a role in that is leveraged by white nationalists and also created by white nationalists is not even acknowledged. So there are so many factors that really have given rise to conspiracy theories like QAnon. And now it's even, I shouldn't say even, but it's also emblematic of how transnational white nationalism has become. And people in Japan, for example, are adherents of Q, even though Q is supposed to be a patriot by many adherents accounts and very close to Donald Trump. So, one would maybe ask, well, why would people in Japan be invested in Q? But they most definitely are because of the factors we previously talked about.
Wow, that's absolutely wild. So in a kind of a summary of some of what you've just said, it's sort of a remix, Q is, of a lot of the old theories that we've seen a lot through white nationalist history since the birth of the country. But again, it's a remix. So there's stuff of contemporary society integrated with some of, as you suggested, some of these well-traveled roads.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It might be a disheartening, record to listen to, but I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it's not a remix you enjoy hearing, but it's a fact. I can't wait to get into this book, Homegrown Hate: Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the United States. It sounds to me as though it's one of those books that was so well researched and so took up so much of your life for so long. I like that at the end of it, you seem to point to a way to tackle some of this. So at least I know that we're reaching toward a solution or potential solutions at the end, huh, Sara?
Yes.
Sara Kamali, good luck with the research. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sara Kamali.
Thanks for joining us. Two really good thinkers. Hope you enjoyed these conversations with Mark and Sara. And until next time, if you want to reach the show, you can reach us at edgewithmarkthompson@gmail.com. Now, until next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.